In July 2025, President Donald Trump shocked the world by slapping a sweeping 35% tariff on most Canadian goods, effective August 1st. The announcement came seemingly out of nowhere, catching even seasoned political observers off guard. It was a move that instantly dominated headlines and sent markets into a tailspin, as investors and business leaders scrambled to assess the fallout. The news, delivered directly to Prime Minister Mark Carney and blasted across every major social media platform, sent shockwaves through both nations' economies. Within hours, Canadian officials were fielding urgent calls from business leaders, while American companies with cross-border ties braced for impact. The sense of uncertainty was palpable, as families and workers on both sides of the border wondered what this would mean for their jobs and livelihoods. Over $2 billion in goods and services crossed the border daily. Now that vital flow was suddenly under threat. From auto parts and fresh produce to high-tech components, the intricate web of trade that had defined US-Canada relations for decades was at risk of unraveling. This was the climax of a year of rising tensions, with Trump's America First agenda targeting Canada as a rival, not a partner. The rhetoric had grown sharper, and behind closed doors, negotiations had stalled. Now the gloves were off. The new tariff was a knockout blow, adding to existing levies on steel, aluminum, and autos. Canadian manufacturers, already struggling with previous rounds of tariffs, now faced an even steeper uphill battle. Small businesses, farmers, and factory workers all braced for the economic shockwaves. Trump warned, any Canadian retaliation would trigger even higher US tariffs. The message was clear: back down or face even harsher consequences. The White House doubled down, insisting the move was necessary to protect American jobs and industries. The timing was strategic, coming just before a key trade negotiation deadline, a high-stakes gamble designed to force Canadian concessions at the bargaining table. Both sides now faced a ticking clock, with billions of dollars and thousands of jobs hanging in the balance. The decades-old foundation of trust in integrated supply chains was being torn apart, replaced by confrontation and uncertainty. Companies that had relied on seamless cross-border trade now faced delays, shortages, and rising costs. Canada's response was swift and defiant. Prime Minister Carney refused to back down, signaling readiness to expand retaliatory tariffs. He addressed the nation, vowing to defend Canadian workers and industries, and to stand firm against what he called economic bullying. The stage was set for a prolonged, painful battle, one that would test both nations' economies and the very future of the USMCA trade pact. Legal teams and trade experts on both sides began preparing for a drawn-out conflict. This was no longer just a trade dispute, it was a fight for sovereignty and economic survival. Across North America, workers, families, and communities braced for the uncertainty ahead, knowing that the outcome would shape their futures. The tariff war had officially begun, with consequences that would ripple across North America for years to come, reshaping alliances, industries, and the very fabric of cross-border life. The Trump administration justified the tariffs with two main arguments: stopping fentanyl at the northern border and addressing the U.S. trade deficit with Canada. These issues were presented as urgent threats to American security and prosperity, with the administration emphasizing the need for immediate action. The trade deficit in particular was highlighted as a sign of economic imbalance. Officials pointed to a growing gap in goods traded between the two countries, arguing that it put American jobs and industries at risk. Trump claimed Canada wasn't doing enough to block the deadly opioid, framing tariffs as a tool for national security. He frequently cited the dangers of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid responsible for thousands of overdose deaths in the U.S., and suggested that tougher trade measures would pressure Canada to act. He also pointed to a $63 billion trade deficit in goods, accusing Canada of unfair trade barriers and practices that disadvantaged American businesses. This narrative was repeated in speeches and interviews, reinforcing the idea that Canada was not playing by the rules. The administration's messaging linked the trade war to the opioid crisis and economic nationalism, rallying support among voters who felt left behind by globalization. By connecting these issues, the White House sought to build a broad coalition in favor of tariffs. Critics, however, noted the trade deficit ignored America's surplus in services and the deep integration of both economies. Many economists argued that focusing only on goods painted a misleading picture, since the U.S. actually benefits from trade in other sectors. The fentanyl claim was even more contentious, with data showing the northern border was a minor entry point. Most illicit fentanyl, experts said, entered the US through other routes, raising questions about the true effectiveness of targeting Canada. Many saw these justifications as pretexts for a broader protectionist agenda. Critics accused the administration of using national security and public health as cover for economic policies aimed at reshaping trade relationships. The real motive, many believed, was to reshape North American trade on U.S. terms, asserting greater control over economic policy and seeking to bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil. The fentanyl argument, while powerful and emotionally charged, didn't hold up to scrutiny when examined closely. Despite the headlines and political rhetoric, the facts painted a very different picture. According to federal data, seizures at the US-Canada border made up less than 0.2% of all fentanyl intercepted nationwide. The overwhelming majority of fentanyl was actually seized at the southern border, not the north. Most illicit fentanyl enters through the southern border, not from Canada. The numbers were clear, yet the narrative persisted, fueled by political motives rather than evidence. The administration's focus on Canada distorted the real picture, using a minor issue to justify sweeping tariffs and trade measures that would have far-reaching consequences. Ottawa pushed back, highlighting new border security measures, increased cooperation with U.S. agencies, and the appointment of a dedicated fentanyl czar to address the crisis. Canadian officials argued that cooperation, not tariffs or blame, was the best way to fight drug trafficking. They emphasized joint efforts and intelligence sharing as the most effective tools. For many observers, the fentanyl narrative seemed like a convenient cover for broader economic goals, allowing leaders to justify tough trade stances under the guise of public health. The true driver behind these actions was the desire to renegotiate trade agreements and reduce the U.S. deficit, rather than a genuine attempt to address the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis, while real and devastating for many communities, was being weaponized for political leverage, turning a public health emergency into a bargaining chip. In the end, the roots of the trade war were economic, not public health, and the fentanyl narrative was just one piece of a much larger strategy. The tariff war didn't erupt overnight, it was a steady escalation. Trump's first move, a 25% tariff on Canadian goods and 10% on energy, right after taking office. A brief pause in February offered hope, but talks stalled and tariffs snapped back in March. Canada tried to de-escalate, dropping a planned digital services tax, but the US responded with even harsher measures. By July, Trump announced the sweeping 35% tariff, punishing Canada for its attempted compromise. The conflict expanded. Steel and aluminum tariffs doubled to 50%. New levies hit copper and autos. Each move targeted a vital Canadian sector, creating a multi-front economic war. The pattern was clear, escalating pressure to extract concessions before the 2026 USMCA review. The era of stable, predictable trade was over. North American commerce was now a battlefield. Canada hit back hard, crafting a targeted response to maximize pain for the U.S. retaliatory tariffs zeroed in on American industries in key political districts: autos, steel, aluminum, and iconic exports like whiskey and orange juice. The goal rallied U.S. businesses and lawmakers against Trump's tariffs. Canada also accelerated trade talks with the EU and UK, seeking to reduce reliance on the U.S. This two-pronged strategy, retaliation and diversification, was a clear defense of Canadian interests. Prime Minister Carney rejected Trump's taunts, framing the dispute as a fight for national dignity. Canada's message: it would not be bullied or absorbed. The counterstrike was both immediate and strategic, aiming to withstand U.S. pressure and chart a more independent future. The trade war was now a test of resolve on both sides. Canada's leaders stood united against U.S. pressure. Prime Minister Carney projected resolve, promising to defend Canadian workers and keep the door open for diplomacy. He emphasized Canada's progress on narcotics and rejected any notion of capitulation. The opposition, led by Pierre Poilievre, echoed the government's stance, condemning the tariffs as unjustified and harmful to both nations. This rare political unity sent a strong signal to Washington. Canada would not be divided. The message was clear: defending economic sovereignty was a national priority. In a time of crisis, Canada's leadership presented a stable, united front. Canada's retaliation sent shockwaves through the U.S. economy. Targeted tariffs hit politically sensitive states, creating powerful domestic pressure to end the dispute. American farmers, automakers, and manufacturers suddenly lost access to their top export market. The auto industry, reliant on cross-border supply chains, was thrown into chaos. Steel, aluminum, and agricultural producers faced cancelled orders and lost revenue. Even consumer goods, from sporting gear to appliances, became less attractive to Canadian buyers. The pain was widespread and intentional, proving trade wars cut both ways. Canada's strategy: make the costs of protectionism impossible for Washington to ignore. As more U.S. industries suffered, pressure mounted on the Trump administration to negotiate. The hope economic pain would force a return to the table. The real victims of the trade war were ordinary workers and consumers. Jobs vanished as supply chains broke down and factories closed on both sides of the border. Prices soared. Cars, electronics, food, and more became costlier for everyone. U.S. tariffs on Canadian raw materials raised costs for American manufacturers, who passed them on to shoppers. The USMCA trade pact was under strain, with its future in doubt. Business investment stalled amid uncertainty, eroding trust built over decades. The lesson: in a global economy, trade wars have no winners, only casualties. The US-Canada conflict was a stark warning about the risks of protectionism and the fragility of economic partnerships.